What if the oldest silence in our history is not an absence, but a trace of something once immense, something that slipped out of reach long before any scripture, kingdom, or chronicle learned to name it? There are moments, brief as a drifting breath, when the mind senses a missing layer beneath the familiar story of our origins, as though a page were quietly removed from a book we never realized was incomplete. Civilizations rise, yet their beginnings dissolve into mist. Myths repeat, yet their roots point toward a place no map remembers. And in that gentle uncertainty, a question stirs. What world preceded ours, and why does its echo feel so carefully veiled? Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is. Perhaps, if you follow this thread a little further, the forgotten will begin to breathe again. It begins with a contradiction so quiet that most histories glide past it without pause, as though its edges were too soft to trouble the official narrative. We are told that human civilization burst forth suddenly, first in Sumer, then mirrored in Egypt, the Indus Valley, and later across the world, as if the earth itself had been waiting for a signal, some unseen cue that urged scattered tribes to step from the twilight of prehistory into the brightness of writing, mathematics, architecture, and statehood. But beneath that tidy sequence lies a tremor of unease. Why did so many distinct cultures awaken within the same narrow window of time, each carrying fragments of astronomical knowledge so advanced that even modern scholars argue over their origins? The Sumerians wrote of planets invisible to the naked eye. The Egyptians aligned monuments with the slow procession of the stars. The megalith builders of Europe tracked solstices with stone shadows cast across landscapes that were supposed to hold only primitive hunters. And throughout these early societies, myths of teachers descending from the sky, bearing agriculture, laws, and the structure of kingship, appear not as embellishments, but as foundations. It is this repetition, this undeniability of motif, that unsettles the standard timeline. A whisper lingers beneath the archived certainties. What if humanity's sudden rise was not truly sudden, but the re-emergence of knowledge that once existed, lost and recovered in fractured forms after an upheaval too vast to remember clearly? Such an upheaval is not outside the scope of geology. The Younger Dryas cooling event roughly 12,800 years ago shattered existing ecosystems and may have swept away entire cultures before they could leave a durable footprint. Archaeologists acknowledge its violence but rarely dwell on its implications for memory. A catastrophic meltwater pulse, floods, tsunamis, atmospheric chaos. These things do not merely erase landscapes, they dissolve stories. If a civilization existed before the known cradle of cities, its remains may lie beneath kilometers of sediment, or submerged along continental shelves swallowed by the ocean's post-glacial rise. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe, dated to around 9600 BCE, appear as if emerging from the fog of an older world, one whose builders held a ritual sophistication that should not have been possible according to the prevailing chronology. Yet there it stands, mute and deliberate, its stones carrying hints of a worldview shaped in a time before the earth was stable. This dissonance invites a deeper question, one that ancient texts dared to suggest long before modern science rediscovered the cataclysms etched into the earth. The Sumerian tablets speak of the Anunnaki, figures described not as gods, but as beings who governed domains, measured time in celestial cycles, and shaped early humanity through instruction rather than magic. Some tablets describe their origins as distant, not metaphorically, but cosmologically. A home among the stars, a lost kingdom where destinies were written. These lines are often dismissed as myth, yet they echo with stubborn consistency across cultures that never interacted. In the Enuma Elish, in the early dynastic Egyptian texts, in the Dogon accounts of Sirius, even in fragments of Mesoamerican cosmologies, there is always a world before world, a realm of the ancient ones, a place that withdrew or fell or turned cold after a cosmic disturbance. The scholarly interpretations vary. Some see these as symbolic descriptions of ancestors or archetypes. Others entertain the possibility that the myths encode astronomical memory, as ancient people tracked the heavens with a precision that modern instrumentation only recently matched. Yet within this ambiguity lies a possibility that is neither fantasy nor trivial. What if the stories recall contact with a culture not terrestrial in its origin, but born from within the solar system itself? An elder sibling to Earth, orbiting the Sun long before our species learned to shape stone tools? The idea of a lost planet is not new. The early astronomers, both ancient and modern, pondered the gap between Mars and Jupiter, a region now filled with broken asteroids that seem too scattered, too violent, to be the remnants of natural formation. The Titius Bode law once predicted a planet there, a harmonious sequence that suggested something had gone missing. Later, the Kirkwood gaps revealed gravitational scars, as though Jupiter's massive presence had disturbed a world into ruin, and while planetary scientists debate the mechanisms, the image that lingers is one of absence, a planet that might once have existed, now fragmented into countless shards drifting silently between worlds. In the 19th century, long before modern spacecraft surveyed the asteroid belt, astronomers speculated about Phaeton, a lost planet destroyed by instability or impact. They could not have known that ancient Mesopotamian texts described something strangely similar, a wandering celestial body, sometimes called a wayward star, sometimes the Dark Companion, sometimes a name whose pronunciation shifts depending on the scholar. Among the more controversial interpretations is Nibiru, a term found in the Babylonian Emul Apin tablets, referring to an object associated with transitions, crossings, and cosmic boundaries. Though academic analyses vary wildly, the possibility lingers that these stories encoded an astronomical memory, one that spoke of a world whose inhabitants once navigated between planets, or one whose destiny was intertwined with Earth in ways we barely grasp. But the story does not hinge on extraordinary claims, it rests on missing context. Humanity remembers so little of its earliest chapters because those chapters were written by forces that do not leave simple archaeological signatures. Solar storms, geomagnetic shifts, orbital perturbations, all phenomena known to science, have occurred many times, each capable of transforming climate, altering coastlines, or triggering migrations that break cultural continuity. If a planet in our solar system destabilized or was destroyed in deep prehistory, its story would not be preserved in rock layers alone. Instead, its echo might persist in myths, in symbols that survived through ritual repetition, in tales of beings who brought knowledge yet mourned a lost homeland. The mosaics of Mesopotamia depict figures holding objects that scholars interpret as ritual bags. Others see them as toolkits. The winged forms surrounding these beings have been likened to symbolic depictions of flight. None of this is definitive, but none of it is meaningless. The question, then, is not whether the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial in the modern sense, but whether they represent a memory of a people whose origin lay beyond the boundaries of our early civilizations, people who survived a planetary catastrophe and carried fragments of their world's legacy to Earth, a diaspora of knowledge-bearers, refugees of a cosmic event, teachers who arrived not as conquerors, but as custodians of a fading culture. This idea fits neither the simplicity of mythology nor the rigidity of academic history, yet it sits uneasily between them, as though waiting for someone to notice the space it occupies. Consider the sudden emergence of advanced sky-watching traditions across early societies. The Babylonians charted planetary motions with mathematical accuracy that would not be formally rediscovered until the Renaissance. The Egyptians built temples aligned with stellar risings that shift over millennia, suggesting a chronology older than their dynasties. The Olmecs and Maya tracked the synodic cycles of Venus with near-perfect precision, despite having no written record of how such observations began. These cultures were separated by oceans, yet all possessed a knowledge of celestial mechanics that implies inheritance, not coincidence. Some researchers point toward a shared ancestral source, one that carried astronomical knowledge across continents before the rise of known civilizations, and while mainstream academia attributes this to generational observation, the timeline required for such precision exceeds the age of many early societies. This creates an anomaly. Either humans had far earlier observational traditions than currently accepted, or they encountered teachers whose mastery of the sky was already complete. A similar subtlety appears in myths of creation through sound or vibration, a curious theme mirrored in modern physics, where resonance shapes matter. The Sumerian texts describe destinies fixed by frequency. Early Indian cosmologies speak of worlds born from waves. Egyptian inscriptions reference the sound that shaped order. While symbolic, such motifs might reflect teachings from a culture that understood the universe in terms more aligned with field dynamics than with anthropomorphic deities. If the survivors of a planetary catastrophe carried scientific knowledge disguised as myth, their insights could have been preserved through metaphor, transformed over generations until the original context dissolved. And yet, even if fragments of an older cosmic story lie beneath these traditions, the question remains: why has so little of it survived? Why is the memory so faint, so fractured? The answer may lie not in deliberate concealment, but in the fragility of human chronology. Catastrophes erase archives faster than they erase stone. Oral traditions warp over centuries. Empires rewrite histories to consolidate power. Religious institutions recast myth into doctrine, stripping away uncomfortable ambiguities. By the time scholars began codifying world history, the deeper layers had already faded into legend, legends then dismissed as superstition. Thus, the possible memory of a lost planet, of visitors or refugees or ancestors whose home lay beyond Earth, became diluted into stories of gods, angels, watchers, or celestial beings whose origins were never meant to be taken literally. But a faint imprint persists. In certain early texts, the Anunnaki are described as those who came in the days when the sky was torn. In others, they are said to have arrived after the Great Waters, suggesting a migration tied to cataclysm. Some tablets refer to a homeland that shattered, its fragments scattered as dust around the throne of the sun. The language is symbolic, yet the symbolism aligns strangely well with the astronomical reality of the asteroid belt, a region of shattered rock orbiting the sun like a graveyard. Still, these parallels do not force a conclusion. They merely invite reflection on the possibility that our understanding of the solar system's past remains incomplete. If a planet once thrived where only debris now drifts, its destruction would have reshaped not only space, but also the destinies of any beings who might have lived there. This brings the narrative back to Earth, not as a solitary cradle of life, but as one refuge among many possible worlds. If the ancient teachers described in early myths carried knowledge from a lost homeland, then the sudden flowering of civilization around 3500 BCE may represent not an invention, but a restoration, a repair of memory guided by those who still carried the echoes of a shattered world. And perhaps that is why the earlier stories feel both familiar and foreign, human, yet touched by something that does not entirely belong to Earth. As the night deepens, one wonders, if fragments of a forgotten planet still drift between Mars and Jupiter, what else drifts through our history, waiting for someone patient enough to notice the spaces where memory was once whole? There is a quiet tension that lingers after considering the possibility of a world lost between Mars and Jupiter. A tension that comes not from the grandeur of the idea, but from the way it casts a soft, unsettling shadow across the earliest chapters of human history. If the Anunnaki stories echo memories of a people whose origins lay beyond Earth, then the next question that surfaces is simpler, more fragile, and far more intimate. Why do so many ancient sources speak of knowledge that appears oddly out of place, as though inherited rather than discovered? Knowledge that arrived already refined, already patterned, as if shaped somewhere else. Take the earliest cuneiform tablets of Sumer, not the later myths, but the administrative and astronomical records, those subtle clay impressions that rarely appear in museum displays, because they are not dramatic enough for the public imagination. Yet these tablets quietly reveal something perplexing. References to orbital periods, planetary motions, and calendar systems so carefully structured that no archaeologist can explain their sudden emergence. The so-called ideal year of 360 days, the division of circles into 360 degrees, the sexagesimal counting system, these are not the products of trial and error. They arrive already formed, like fragments of a curriculum. The same pattern emerges in Egypt, where the earliest dynastic astronomer priests monitored the rising of Sirius with such precision that they recorded the heliacal cycle to a degree of accuracy difficult even for modern naked-eye observers. The temples at Abydos and Dendera appear to carry architectural memories of stellar alignments that trace back to epochs long before Egypt's own civilization flourished. yet no inscriptions explain when these traditions began, only that they were inherited. The followers of Horus, one of the most enigmatic groups mentioned in early Egyptian sources, are described not as priests or kings, but as predecessors, bearers of knowledge from an earlier age whose roots were never clarified. Even the Indus Valley, whose script remains undeciphered, leaves hints of a worldview synchronized with lunar and planetary cycles, though no surviving text reveals how such a system was developed. And in China's earliest astronomical records, dating back millennia, cycles of Jupiter, Saturn, and lunar nodes are tracked with a sophistication that seems disproportionate to the archaeological footprint of the culture at the time. It is almost as if these societies awoke with a memory, not a full one, but a patterned residue, a rhythm echoing from elsewhere. This sense of inheritance, of knowledge resurfacing rather than emerging, invites reflection on a possibility quietly discussed in comparative mythology, that early cities may have been built according to templates, not invented from scratch. Archaeologists occasionally note the odd uniformity of ancient sacred precincts, the way their angles, courtyards, and axes mirror each other across different geographies. The recurring motif of a central axis aligned to the heavens appears in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mesoamerica, and even Neolithic Europe. Cultural diffusion might explain some overlaps, but not all. And when the similarities reach beyond architecture into cosmology, ritual structure, and symbolic grammar, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. In this shared symbolic language, a peculiar figure appears again and again, a being who descends to bring order, to teach calendars, to bestow laws, to restructure the chaos of early human life. In Mesopotamia, this figure is sometimes Enki, sometimes Enlil, sometimes a composite of several Anunnaki. In Mesoamerica, it becomes Quetzalcoatl or Viracocha, white-robed, bearded, speaking of harmony and knowledge, yet not of this world. In Aboriginal traditions, the Wandjina descend, painting their likenesses on rock, oversized heads, large eyes, and halos that have puzzled anthropologists for decades. Across Polynesia, legends of arriving teachers describe luminous sky boats. Among the Dogon, the Nommo descend from the dark companion of Sirius, bringing structure to a fragmented world. The consistency of these descent myths, each embroidered by culture yet anchored in a core theme, gives the impression of memory refracted across centuries. Not a metaphor for natural forces, as some scholars argue, but recollections of an encounter so formative that it imprinted itself onto every early civilization in parallel ways. If this memory points to visitors, not divine in the religious sense, but knowledgeable in ways early humans could not comprehend, then the next question grows heavier. Why would those visitors come here at all? Why Earth, of all places in this enormous solar system? One answer circles back to the asteroid belt, that silent graveyard of stone. If a planet once thrived there, if a culture flourished upon it before its destruction, then Earth, stable, temperate, abundant, might have offered refuge. Not as conquerors seeking dominion, but as survivors seeking continuity. In this light, the Anunnaki stories take on a new tone, not of domination, but of inheritance. The tablets speak not of gods demanding obedience, but of beings preserving knowledge, setting structures in place to help a young species avoid the fate of their own homeworld. The term seed appears in some translations, life scattered, protected, guided. This is not the language of mythology alone. It resonates with theories in modern astrobiology, where the concept of panspermia considers the possibility that life, or its building blocks, may travel between worlds. That idea, once ridiculed, now sits comfortably within scientific discussion. Meteorites carry organic compounds. Extremophils survive in environments once believed impossible. Space is no longer a sterile void, but a medium through which life may drift, carried by impact events, comets, or technological means. And yet, even if one entertains the idea that Earth received knowledge or influence from another world, the continuity of that influence seems to vanish abruptly. The earliest civilizations bloom with order, mathematics, monumental architecture, celestial precision. Then, over time, the clarity fades, the knowledge dilutes, cultures diverge, conflicts rise, the memory fragments into myth. Why would the guidance stop? Why would those early visitors or survivors disappear? Some ancient texts offer a bittersweet hint. They speak of a departure, a withdrawal, a moment when the teachers stepped back, leaving humanity to shape its own destiny. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Divine Council laments a time when humans no longer listened, no longer remembered, no longer honoured the precision of the stars. In early Vedic commentaries, cycles of ages describe periods when contact between worlds was easier, then gradually became restricted. The Maya spoke of suns that rose and fell, each era governed by a different relationship between the heavens and the earth. It is possible that this withdrawal was not a choice, but a necessity. If the remnants of the lost planet still drift as asteroids, perhaps the survivors faced resource collapse or technological limitations that made continued interaction impossible. Or perhaps the solar system itself changed. Magnetic fields shifting, orbital resonances altering trajectories, cosmic conditions creating barriers that did not exist before. The ancient accounts that reference the firmament hardening, or the veil between worlds closing, may be poetic reflections of astronomical transformations we do not yet fully understand. But the withdrawal also aligns with a quieter, more human truth. Civilizations rise and fall according to cycles of stability and chaos. Perhaps the survivors attempted to seed knowledge on Earth, but over generations their numbers dwindled, their culture diluted, their memory overtaken by the dominant narratives of human societies. The Anunnaki stories might have evolved from real interactions with a dwindling group of outsiders into mythic interpretations as the last of those beings faded into obscurity. There is an archaeological parallel to this idea. Isolated cultures across the world often interpret technologically advanced visitors as supernatural beings. Cargo cults in the Pacific, born in the early 20th century, demonstrate how easily humans elevate unfamiliar technology into sacred mythology. If something similar happened in prehistory, if survivors of a shattered world carried knowledge to early humans, then over millennia, the original context would dissolve. What remained would be stories of sky gods, heavenly craft, divine tools, and beings who shaped destinies before vanishing. This brings the narrative to an even more delicate layer. The question of why Earth's earlier civilizations exhibited sudden leaps, only to plateau or regress. After the construction of Göbekli Tepe, no similar monumental structures appear in the region for thousands of years. After the Old Kingdom, Egypt's pyramids decline in precision and engineering quality. After the Indus Valley's peak, urban planning nearly disappears from the subcontinent for centuries. It is as though a burst of inherited memory gradually faded, leaving humanity to rebuild or reinterpret the remnants. This fading of clarity echoes a theme found in Mesopotamian lamentations. One tablet describes a time when the stars no longer taught men their ways. Another speaks of the forgetting, a period when the sacred measures and cycles were lost. The language is mournful, reflective, not the voice of fantasy, but of cultural memory fracturing. Even linguistic traces offer subtle hints. Some Sumerian words lack known etymology, as if imported from a language with no terrestrial relatives. Their grammar stands isolated, not tied to any known family. A similar mystery surrounds the language of the Minoans, whose scripts remain undeciphered, and the Basque language of Europe, which has no confirmed relation to Indo-European tongues. These linguistic anomalies may represent remnants of older cultural layers, echoes of migrations or contacts long forgotten. And then there is the curious case of symbolic artifacts. Cylinder seals from Mesopotamia depict figures interacting with objects that resemble star maps or devices of measurement. Egyptian reliefs show beings holding instruments whose function remains ambiguous, neither purely symbolic nor clearly utilitarian. The Dogon's sacred drawings appear to encode astronomical information about the Sirius system not visible without modern instruments. Though this claim is debated, the persistence of the motif remains intriguing. None of these fragments prove anything, but collectively they form a constellation of anomalies, each glimmering with the possibility that something older, deeper, and more complex lies beneath the surface of human origins. Within this constellation, one detail stands out: the repeated emphasis on sequences. The Anunnaki stories revolve around cycles, of kingship, of cosmic ages, of returns. The Sumerian king list records reigns that span tens of thousands of years before the flood, durations dismissed by scholars as symbolic. Yet their symbolism may point to something else, an ancient attempt to encode time according to a different calibration, perhaps the orbital rhythm of a world no longer present. If the lost planet's year was dramatically longer than Earth's, its inhabitants might have carried their own timekeeping traditions. The king lists may reflect memories of those long spans, compressed or misunderstood by later scribes. In this light, the flood becomes not a local river event, but a memory of planetary upheaval, echoed across Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, the Americas, and Australia. Geological evidence of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age aligns uncannily with global myths of a great deluge. It is as though the world shared a trauma so profound that its memory survived everywhere, even after the details blurred. But what if the trauma did not originate on Earth alone? What if the flood myths, the sky fracture myths, the departure myths, and the descent myths all stem from a single interaction between two worlds, one thriving, one dying, each shaping the other's fate? The idea is not that a lost planet explains everything, but that its story might lie at the periphery of our own, a quiet shadow influencing the early steps of human civilization before receding into forgottenness. The deeper one looks into ancient records, the more it seems as though early humanity was not simply inventing culture, but reconstructing it, reassembling fragments of a puzzle whose centre lay somewhere beyond Earth. The act of remembering became myth. The act of forgetting became history. And between those two acts lies the unresolved space where truth once dwelled. As the thread unwinds, one begins to wonder, if early humans inherited even a fraction of a story that began on another world, then what else have we mistaken for myth merely because we no longer recognize the context? There is a moment, subtle and nearly imperceptible, when the threads of an old narrative pull taut in the mind, threads that stretch across continents, epochs, and ruins, hinting that early humanity moved within a world shaped by echoes of something older, something that did not begin on Earth. After tracing the possibility of inherited knowledge and the memory of a vanished world, the next layer reveals itself not through the grand monuments or written myths, but through the quieter inconsistencies that lie between them. These inconsistencies form a kind of negative space, a shape defined not by what is present, but by what is missing. One such absence lies in the origins of kingship. In culture after culture, sovereignty appears not as a gradual evolution, but as a sudden structured descent. The earliest Sumerian inscriptions refer to kingship as having descended from the heavens. In Egypt, the pharaoh is not merely a political figure but a vessel of divine legitimacy, an intermediary connected to beings who preceded mankind. In the earliest Chinese chronicles, the Yellow Emperor is described as an arrival, a bringer of order, bringing institutions as though from a prior template. Even among the Maya, rulership is depicted as part of a cosmic lineage, bestowed by figures whose identities blur between myth and memory. These accounts do not describe kings emerging from tribes through social negotiation, or leaders slowly rising out of necessity. They speak of something bestowed, something transferred, something reminiscent of a council or a lineage not born on Earth. When cross-referenced, these disparate traditions yield a curious pattern. Rulership begins not with humans organizing themselves, but with memories of beings who arrive possessing knowledge, technologies, and rituals too refined for early societies to invent. The pattern persists in the structure of law. The earliest known legal systems, whether the codes of Ur-Nammu, the edicts of Hammurabi, the teachings attributed to Manu in India, or the foundational moral laws referenced in early Hebrew texts, appear suddenly, codified, complete. They do not read like the gradual outputs of trial and error. They read like imported frameworks. Even Hammurabi, in his prologue, claims to have received his laws from a divine figure who revealed them, not through prophecy, but with a sense of direct instruction. What is curious is that similar motifs appear in Mesoamerica, where Quetzalcoatl is remembered as having given laws to the Toltecs. Across Polynesia, knowledge-bearers arrive from distant skies with rituals for governance and social harmony. In Africa, certain traditions speak of the first teachers, beings who brought law before bringing agriculture. This uncomfortable synchronicity leads back to the question of the Anunnaki, not as mythic arbiters, but as potential custodians of a knowledge older than Earth's civilizations. If their homeworld truly existed once, destroyed or transformed long before written history, it is plausible that their society possessed structures of governance that survived in fragments through the cultures they touched. These fragments may have been reshaped into the divine right of kings, priestly hierarchies, and cosmic legal codes, the remnants of a political philosophy formed on another world, refracted through human memory. But if the earliest laws and rulers were influenced by beings with a memory of another planet, then what traces of that planetary origin would survive in human institutions? One clue lies in the peculiar uniformity of sacred numbers. The number 12, divisions of the zodiac, months, governing councils, appears globally, even where there is no evidence of intercultural contact. The number 7 recurs in ceremonial contexts, cosmological structures, and mythic genealogies. The number 60 dominates Mesopotamian systems, despite being impractical for daily life, yet perfect for celestial calculations. These numbers do not arise naturally from Earth's cycles alone. They suggest a mathematical worldview imported wholesale, one that may reflect the orbital rhythms or cultural systems of a lost world. Astronomers have long noted that Earth cycles do not neatly match the 360-degree circle used in ancient geometry. Some propose that this geometry came not from Earth-based observation, but from an inherited conceptual model, one perhaps shaped by a different planetary environment. If a lost world once orbited with a more symmetrical cycle, its inhabitants might have developed a base 60 or 360-degree system organically, later transferring it to Earth. In that case, the circular perfection of ancient geometry may be a memory of a sky not our own. The next inconsistency emerges not from numbers but from landscapes. Landscapes shaped by human hands long before any culture is supposed to have possessed the tools to shape them. High atop the Bolivian Altiplano lies Puma Punku, a site whose megaliths appear to have been carved with such precision that modern engineers marvel at their symmetry. Stones weighing dozens of tons fit together with interlocking joints so refined they resemble machine-crafted components. The site predates the Inca by millennia, yet no known culture in the region possessed the technological ability to cut, transport, or assemble these structures. Similar anomalies appear at Baalbek in Lebanon, where stones of unimaginable size form foundations that later civilizations merely built upon. At Giza, erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest exposure to rainfall far earlier than Egypt's desert climate would allow, potentially dating the monument to an era before pharaohs existed. And on Yap, the stone discs transported across hundreds of kilometers float like an unanswered question. How were they shaped, and why? These anomalies do not require extraterrestrial intervention, but they do invite speculation that early humans were imitating constructions they had seen before, constructions brought by travelers from another world, or survivors of a lost planet whose engineering traditions far exceeded the capabilities of early Earth cultures. If a group of refugees arrived with tools, knowledge, and architectural skills, early human societies may have attempted to replicate what they saw, resulting in degraded copies over generations. Such degradation is not merely an architectural pattern, it appears in mythology as well. The earliest myths describe beings who could shape stone, travel through air, harness the power of the heavens. Later myths reinterpret these abilities through the lens of gods wielding thunderbolts or magical powers, their technologies forgotten. The further back one looks, the more familiar these beings appear. The further forward one goes, the more distorted they become. Perhaps the most striking of these distortions lies in the depictions of winged beings across ancient art. Scholars interpret the wings as symbols of divinity or speed. But there is another possibility. Wings as artistic representations of flight technology. A stylized interpretation of something unfamiliar, re-rendered through symbolism because the original function was not understood. When the Dogon describe the Nommo descending in a vessel that spun and burned, they are not describing a miracle, they are describing a machine. When the Hopi speak of beings who arrive through ant-like suits and taught survival skills, they are not imagining insects. They are translating an unfamiliar form. When the ancient Chinese texts describe dragons descending from the heavens, their twisting bodies and roaring entrances may be memories of smoke trails, engines, the fury of controlled propulsion translated into mythic imagery. This reframing is uncomfortable, yet it aligns with a deeper theme. Early humanity did not invent stories of descent, they remembered them. To understand why this memory grew faint, one must examine the nature of catastrophes. The Younger Dryas event, for example, did not merely reshape landscapes, it severed cultural continuity. Archaeological evidence from North America indicates that entire species vanished almost overnight. Across Europe and the Near East, populations collapsed, migration patterns shifted, and settlement footprints disappeared for centuries. If humanity's earliest contact with off-world survivors occurred before or during such events, the chaos would have shattered any coherent transmission of knowledge. The survivors, both human and non-human, might have been forced to disperse, hide, or abandon attempts at guiding early societies. In this context, the worldwide flood myths acquire new weight. They may not describe a single event, but a cluster of catastrophic experiences woven into one narrative. Floods, ocean rise, comet impacts, tsunamis, all appear in geological records at the close of the last ice age. If the Anunnaki, or any group of survivors from a lost world, attempted to sustain their presence on Earth, the environmental upheaval may have rendered such efforts futile. Their numbers may have dwindled, their technologies may have deteriorated, their memory, preserved only in fragmented oral traditions, slowly became the mythic scaffolding upon which later religions were built. But if any of these beings survived into early human history, where did they go? Some traditions hint that they withdrew to remote places, mountaintops, hidden valleys, regions too difficult for large populations to reach. The Shining Ones of Celtic lore reside in hollow hills. The Asuras and Devas of Indian tradition travel between dimensions or hidden realms. The Tuatha De Danann retreat into mounds after losing a human battle, described as descending into the earth, though not as death. In the Near East, certain texts speak of beings who retreated to the high places, perhaps symbolic, perhaps literal. There is another possibility, that these survivors integrated into human populations over generations, their distinctiveness fading through intermarriage or concealment. If their lifespan, physiology, or appearance differed only subtly, their traits may persist today in ways we no longer recognize. Myths of long-lived rulers, sages with extraordinary abilities, or figures endowed with unusual wisdom might not be metaphors. They might be genealogical echoes. Even the biblical accounts of the Nephilim, giants born of the sons of God and human women, may reflect culturally refracted memories of interbreeding between humans and outsiders, possessing advanced capabilities. While scholars approach such narratives cautiously, their persistence across cultures suggests an underlying phenomenon interpreted differently in each region. But rather than focusing on the spectacular, the more compelling question lies in the mundane. Why did humanity forget? Memory loss is not always the result of conspiracy or suppression. Often, it is exhaustion. Catastrophe drains the capacity for preservation. When populations struggle to survive, libraries burn, rituals break, stories shrink to simplified forms, oral traditions compress, meanings shift. A lineage that once carried knowledge of astronomy and engineering becomes a priesthood, with vague rituals and half-remembered symbols. A surviving remnant of an advanced people becomes a legend of gods. A technical device becomes a sacred artifact whose purpose is no longer understood. This cognitive erosion is visible throughout history. After the Bronze Age collapse, civilizations across the Mediterranean lost writing systems. After the fall of the Roman Empire, engineering knowledge declined. Regressions occur not because people become less intelligent, but because continuity breaks. If humanity once shared its world with beings from a lost planet, the disappearance of their presence would have triggered a deeper regression, one that eroded not just technology or institutions, but the memory of contact itself. Yet something remains, a residue, a structural imprint, in the recurring symbols, in the sudden inventions, in the mathematical precision, in the cosmological obsessions, in the way humanity seems always to be remembering something it can no longer fully articulate. And perhaps the most haunting remnants lie not in monuments or myths, but in the persistent intuition, felt across cultures, that humanity is not alone, not in the religious sense of metaphysical deities, but in the historical sense of having once shared the solar system with another intelligent species, a species whose story intersected ours, then dissolved into obscurity following a catastrophe too immense to preserve intact. A species whose homeworld shattered into the silent stones we now call asteroids. If this intuition carries even a whisper of truth, then a question quietly surfaces beneath all the others. How much of what we call human civilization is truly ours, and how much is the pale reflection of a world long gone? There is a point, almost imperceptible, where the narrative of early humanity darkens, not with fear, but with the quiet gravity of something long buried. After tracing the echoes of a lost world, of knowledge inherited rather than discovered, and of beings whose presence receded into mythology, the next layer rises like a faint outline beneath the sediment of time, the possibility that Earth itself bears scars of an encounter more ancient than any civilization now remembered. Scars written not in texts or symbols, but in geology, in magnetic fields, in unexplained anomalies scattered across continents like the residue of a forgotten event. One such anomaly appears in the Earth's crust, a curious distribution of heavy metals that does not match known geological processes. In the 1970s, geologists studying the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods discovered unusual iridium concentrations, an element rare on Earth's surface yet common in certain types of meteorites. The finding eventually led to the asteroid impact theory that explains the extinction of the dinosaurs. But deeper in the stratigraphic record lie other anomalies, smaller yet persistent, whose origins are not easily attributed to natural processes. Certain layers contain isotopic signatures inconsistent with volcanic activity or meteor deposition. Some appear abruptly, as though deposited during an event that left no crater, no debris field, only a fingerprint of disruption. A parallel anomaly lies in magnetic excursions, sudden temporary collapses of Earth's magnetic field documented in ice cores and sedimentary records. One such event, the Lachamp excursion around 42,000 years ago, coincided with a puzzling period of instability in human populations. Another excursion, less documented but still evident, appears roughly at the onset of the Younger Dryas. These fluctuations altered atmospheric chemistry, increased radiation exposure, and potentially contributed to climate chaos. But what is striking is the way ancient myths describe moments when the sky cracked, or the shield of the world weakened, or the heavens changed their course. While symbolic, such phrases may reflect folk memories of geological and magnetic instability that may have overlapped with interactions between Earth and remnants of the lost planet. For if a world once orbited between Mars and Jupiter, and if its destruction scattered debris across the solar system, then Earth would not have escaped unscathed. Even minor impacts of such debris, chilled fragments, metallic fragments, dust clouds, could disturb climate, disrupt magnetic fields, or catalyze environmental upheavals. The Younger Dryas boundary layer contains nanodiamonds, microspherules, and melt glass droplets, materials consistent with high-temperature impacts but lacking a definitive crater. Some researchers propose a fragmented comet, but others note that such materials resemble industrial byproducts, not in the sense of human industry, but in the sense of processes associated with technological or energetic events. It is here that the narrative becomes uneasy. The idea of non-human technology existing tens of thousands of years ago confronts modern sensibilities, yet myths persist of celestial wars, of battles in the heavens, of skies aflame. The Mahabharata describes weapons that burned like 1,000 suns, leaving hair and nails falling away. Greek texts speak of Phaethon losing control of a chariot that scorched the world. Norse sagas recall the sky split by fire before the Fimbul winter. Mesoamerican codices depict serpents of fire descending from the heavens. Such accounts, while mythologized, share an odd specificity: heat, light, instability, aftermath. One need not interpret these stories literally to consider the possibility that ancient people witnessed atmospheric events caused by fragments of a destroyed planet entering Earth's atmosphere. Comet debris, asteroid showers, plasma discharges, mundane explanations exist. Yet the global uniformity of these motifs suggests that something extraordinary happened, something that impressed itself on the collective memory of early humanity so strongly that the imagery endured for millennia. What matters is not whether the event was natural or artificial, but that its memory survived. Within this memory lies another thread, one tied to the earliest cosmologies describing Earth's relationship with a wandering body, a planet or star whose passage brought both knowledge and destruction. The Babylonian astral texts speak of a crossing star associated with upheaval. The Egyptians reference a red eye that brought both chaos and renewal. The Greeks write of a planet whose appearance signaled great change. These descriptions are often interpreted metaphorically, yet they bear resemblance to modern models of rogue planetary fragments or deep-orbit bodies whose periodic returns might disturb gravitational stability. Some fringe theories suggest that survivors of a lost planet travelled through the solar system aboard engineered vessels. But even without invoking spacecraft, one can imagine a scenario in which fragments of their world, still containing dormant technology, drifted into Earth's proximity. Over time, the remnants might have decayed, deactivated, or disintegrated. But early humans may have witnessed their arrival: strange lights in the sky, thunderous sounds, materials falling to Earth, and perhaps even encounters with beings who came seeking refuge. The archaeology of extraterrestrial contact need not reveal intact machines. It may reveal subtle anomalies, metals that do not match known smelting processes, stones cut with unexplained techniques, structures aligned with celestial bodies in ways suggestive of pre-existing knowledge. The Baghdad battery, the Antikythera mechanism, the Lanzhou stone with metallic inclusions, all contested, all mysterious. None conclusive, yet each a reminder that the history of technology is not as linear as textbooks suggest. Yet the most intriguing evidence of a forgotten encounter does not lie in artifacts, it lies in genetics. In 2010, the discovery of the Denisovan lineage startled evolutionary biology. Here was a hominin group whose DNA survives in modern humans, particularly in Oceania and parts of Asia, yet whose fossil record is almost non-existent. Their genetic contribution includes traits that improve high-altitude survival in Tibetans, an adaptation whose origin remains unclear. The Denisovans appear suddenly, disappear suddenly, and leave behind a genetic legacy out of proportion to their archaeological footprint. Their existence demonstrates that entire intelligent populations can rise and vanish without leaving extensive material remains. Similarly, the so-called ghost populations inferred through genetic analysis, unknown hominin lines that contributed to the human genome but left no fossils, suggest that our evolutionary history is incomplete. If Earth can host entire intelligent species that leave barely a trace, why could it not host remnants of a population from another world, especially if their numbers were small, their integration gradual, their survival fragile? What if the interbreeding stories found in myth, between gods and humans, watchers and mortals, sky beings and earth dwellers, are refracted memories of genetic exchange between humans and an advanced group not native to this planet? Such exchanges would not need to be large. A small community integrating over time could leave only faint traces, detectable perhaps through rare alleles or unusual clusters in mitochondrial DNA. Modern geneticists occasionally note anomalous segments in certain populations, segments with no known match among earthly hominins. These anomalies are usually attributed to statistical noise or insufficient sampling. Yet the possibility remains that a tiny fragment of an off-world lineage persists, hidden within the tapestry of modern humanity. This brings the narrative to another domain, architecture aligned not only to the sky, but to frequencies. Ancient sites such as Chavin de Huántar in Peru contain acoustic chambers engineered to manipulate sound in ways modern visitors find disorienting. Newgrange in Ireland resonates at low frequencies that align with certain brainwave states. The hippodrome of Halsaflieni in Malta produces standing waves that amplify human vocalizations to uncanny degrees. These structures were not built haphazardly. Their acoustic properties appear intentional. Yet no known culture from their time possessed the mathematical framework to design such architecture consciously, unless, of course, they inherited it. If the survivors of a lost planet understood harmonics, resonance, or the physics of energy distribution, early humans may have imitated what they witnessed, gradually losing the underlying principles while preserving the forms. Over time, the structures became ritual sites, their original purpose forgotten. This pattern mirrors how ancient people preserved astronomical alignments without understanding precession, or how they repeated sacred numbers without recalling their origin. Even more mysterious are the global traditions of initiation within caves, chambers, or stone-lined passages, spaces that induce altered states through resonance, vibration, or sensory deprivation. These rituals appear across Australia, Siberia, Europe, the Americas, and Africa. Cultures separated by oceans yet linked by an understanding of sound as a conduit to the divine. Perhaps they reflect a memory of communication methods or consciousness practices from a world where harmonics were integral to daily life. This thread intertwines with another, the global obsession with the stars. Early humans did not merely observe the heavens, they oriented their lives around them. Stone circles track solstices, pyramids mirror constellations. Myths trace the origins of culture to specific star clusters: Sirius, Orion, the Pleiades. The Dogon's knowledge of the Sirius companion star, the Maori genealogies linking ancestors to the sky, the Aboriginal Dreamtime tracks mapping the Milky Way, all suggest an inherited cosmology, not an invented one. If the Anunnaki or other off-world survivors carried with them the memory of their home system, they may have emphasized certain constellations that held significance to their past. Early cultures, absorbing these stories, encoded them into architecture and myth. Over time, the meaning weakened, but the patterns remained. This possibility gains weight when one examines the peculiar importance of Orion and the Pleiades, constellations that recur in origin stories across continents. The Great Pyramid's shafts align with Orion's belt, a pattern mirrored in Mexico's Teotihuacan. The Pleiades signal agricultural cycles in cultures that never exchanged knowledge. The Japanese trace their origins to the Pleiades, calling them Subaru, the gathering. The Maori begin their new year with the rising of Matariki, the same cluster. The Pleiades appear in Greek myth as the Seven Sisters. Among the Maya, they mark the transition between epochs. Why this particular cluster? Why this uniformity? Unless its significance predates Earth's civilizations, perhaps tied to memories carried by those who arrived long ago. But as these threads converge, the question of disappearance returns with renewed weight. If beings from a lost planet influenced early humanity, where did they ultimately go? Some traditions suggest ascension, a return to the heavens. Others describe a retreat, a diminishing, a gradual fading until only stories remained. A few hint at destruction, implying that those who survived the fall of their world faced a second tragedy on Earth. The Book of Enoch, for example, speaks of watchers punished for teaching forbidden knowledge, though the text is allegorical. In Mesopotamian records, certain Anunnaki vanish abruptly from later tablets, replaced by younger gods. In Mesoamerican myths, Quetzalcoatl departs by sea or flame, promising to return. Polynesian stories describe luminous beings who flew home. Norse mythology ends with Ragnarok, a cosmic dissolution that leaves only fragments of the old order. Even in Egyptian lore, the followers of Horus disappear from history, their legacy preserved only in priestly titles. These departures may reflect political changes, cultural shifts, or mythic reorganization. But they may also reflect a literal vanishing, an extinction, assimilation, or withdrawal of a small remnant population unable to sustain itself. It is equally possible that the survivors' technology eventually failed. Machines degrade, knowledge fades. Without access to the resources of their homeworld, they may have been unable to maintain their systems. Once their tools failed, they became indistinguishable from early humans. Within a few generations, they may have blended in entirely. The last of them may have died without leaving written testimony, their origins preserved only in the symbolic language of myth. And yet, the imprint remains, in the architecture, the astronomy, the mathematics, the symbols, the genetic anomalies, the rituals, the myths that refuse to die. These imprints form a silent map, a map pointing not to answers, but to an enduring absence. An absence that raises a quiet, unsettling reflection. If an entire civilization once lived within our solar system and was erased, what guarantees that our own will not one day become just another faint echo in the myths of a future species? There comes a point in tracing these shadows, of vanished worlds, inherited laws, astronomical memories and fractured origins, where the narrative no longer feels like speculation, but something closer to recognition. A faint sense of déjà vu settles in, as if humanity has been circling around the same forgotten truth for thousands of years, glimpsing it only in fragments, in ruins that should not exist, in symbols that feel older than the cultures that carved them, in myths that describe not fantasies but memories blurred by time. The next layer of this long meditative unravelling emerges not from stone or sky, but from the strange tension between ancient knowledge and the places where knowledge disappears, a tension most visible in the oldest libraries, those that survived long enough to leave the impression of something greater that once existed. Consider the Library of Ashurbanipal, the last great archive of Mesopotamia. Among its tens of thousands of clay tablets lie fragments hinting at a tradition far older than the empire that collected them. Lists of kings whose reigns stretch across impossible spans, astronomical treatises describing celestial pathways known only through mathematics, hymns from Sumer that reference beings from the days before the lands were set in their places. These tablets are not the origin of the stories, they are the end of them, the final echo of something transmitted through countless cycles of collapse and rediscovery. And yet, even here, the deeper context is missing. Scribal traditions refer to earlier sources, earlier records, earlier libraries, archives that no longer exist. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions inscriptions upon stone from before the flood. The priests of Babylon spoke of tablets held in sanctuaries, older than kingship. Greek scholars travelling through Egypt described halls of records said to preserve knowledge from a time when the gods walked among men. But these older archives vanished, burned, drowned, buried, forgotten. The destruction of libraries is not merely a loss of information, it is a tearing of threads. And the world's early libraries were not lost through accidents alone. They were destroyed with a peculiar consistency, as if certain histories were repeatedly vulnerable to erasure. The Library of Alexandria, burned in stages over centuries, held works that claimed to trace humanity back through cycles of cosmic catastrophe. The Library of Pergamon suffered a similar fate. Even the Mayan codices were reduced to ash by the order of men who feared the power of stories that did not fit their worldview. These burnings did more than erase records. They forced the surviving knowledge into the realm of myth. When entire civilizations lose their archives, they lose the ability to question their own origins. They become children unaware of their ancestors, but scattered among the ruins are artifacts that hint at a tradition older than any surviving library. Clay tablets listing unfamiliar constellations, stone carvings marking precession cycles that only long-term observation could reveal, star maps in tombs predating the dynasties that supposedly invented astronomy. Even the enigmatic Nebra sky disk, bronze, gold, and celestial symbols arranged with precision, appears as an echo of a tradition brought from elsewhere, maintained in fragments long after the context had eroded. What these objects share is not their age, but the feeling that they were not the first of their kind. They feel like copies of copies, distorted survivals of an original knowledge system whose creators vanished. This sense deepens when we consider ancient myths about lost epochs, myths so widespread that they appear less like stories and more like collective memory. Cultures across the world describe cycles of creation and destruction, each governed by forces older than humanity. The Greeks called them ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. The Hindus described yugas spanning millions of years. The Maya centered their calendar on the idea of suns that rise and fall, each marking a different era of existence. The Zoroastrians believed in recurring cycles of cosmic struggle and renewal. These cycles echo an idea rarely spoken aloud in mainstream archaeology, the possibility that humanity's known history is only the latest iteration of something older, something interrupted multiple times by events so catastrophic that they erased almost everything except scattered myths, fragments of stonework, and the faint memory of teachers who came before. This possibility aligns uncannily with geological evidence of repeated cataclysms, volcanic winters, supernova radiation bursts, impact events, sudden sea level rises, abrupt climate oscillations. Each event powerful enough to devastate early societies before they reached a level capable of preserving long-term records. If beings from a lost planet interacted with early humanity, these catastrophes may have fractured their presence into isolated enclaves, small groups struggling to maintain knowledge in a world unprepared to support it. Which leads us to another question. What traces might remain of such enclaves? Not monumental ruins or vast empires, those require stability, but small sanctuaries, scattered communities, perhaps even remnants of technology repurposed into ritual objects. And indeed, across the world, there exist enigmatic sites that feel less like ceremonial centres and more like repositories, places where knowledge was hidden, protected or encoded through metaphor. Göbekli Tepe, for instance, appears not as a settlement, but as a sanctuary intentionally buried after its use. The pillars carry astronomical carvings, animal symbols, and a cosmology that predates agriculture by millennia. Some researchers suggest the site may preserve knowledge from an earlier world, encoded symbolically to survive the chaos of the Ice Age's end. In India, the mysterious yantras, geometric diagrams used in meditation and ritual, represent complex mathematical relationships expressed through simple forms. Their origins are unknown. They appear suddenly, already complete without a developmental lineage. Some scholars believe they may encode star charts, energy patterns, or cosmological principles inherited from an earlier cultural layer. The Hopi mesas, aligned to Orion's belt, form a terrestrial mirror of a celestial pattern. The Dogon villages align similarly. The pyramids of Giza do as well. None of these cultures interacted in documented history, yet each reproduced the same celestial geometry linked to myths of otherworldly teachers. Perhaps more intriguing is the distribution of megaliths across remote islands: Easter Island, the Azores, the Canaries, the Marquesas, places separated by vast ocean distances yet bearing similarities in stonework and cosmological symbolism. These islands may have served as waypoints or refuges for survivors of a lost world, or as sites where early humans preserved a fading tradition without fully understanding it. Even the arrangement of global sacred sites into geometric patterns, aligned along great circles or orthodromic lines, suggests that the builders possessed geographic knowledge beyond their technological era. Some of these alignments correspond to ancient equinox points, hinting at an origin older than the structures themselves. These fragments, scattered and incomplete, point toward a blueprint, a memory of how the world was once understood, perhaps by a culture whose worldview transcended planetary boundaries. But if such a culture existed, its worldview would not be limited to stone and stars. It would permeate language, ritual, and cosmology. And here we encounter one of the most intriguing mysteries of all, the global myth of the cosmic tree. In Norse mythology, it is Yggdrasil, the axis connecting realms. In India, it is the Ashvattha tree, with roots in the heavens and branches on earth. In Mesoamerica, the world tree links underworld, earth, and sky. In Siberia, shamans climb the cosmic birch to reach the stars. In Africa, the world tree connects ancestors to celestial origin. This symbol appears everywhere. It is not tied to culture or geography. It is older than agriculture, older than writing, perhaps older than Homo sapiens' dispersal across the world. Some anthropologists argue that the world tree represents the Milky Way or the axis of Earth's rotation. But the consistency of the motif suggests more than astronomical observation. In a civilization that travelled between worlds, or even between habitats in space, the notion of a cosmic axis would be practical, not metaphorical. It could represent a passage, a route, a gateway between orbits or stations. Over time, its technological meaning may have faded into symbolic description. The same could be said for the global flood, the sky mountain, the heavenly ladder, the beings of a light, the watchers, all recurring motifs that may represent not supernatural entities, but the refracted memory of a technological civilization seen through the eyes of early humans. Yet as humanity reconstructed its own history, these motifs were reinterpreted, codified, ritualized, and eventually stripped of their original context. The world tree became a symbol of spiritual ascent. The watchers became angels or demons. The cosmic cycles became mythological metaphors. The laws of the teachers became religious commandments. The star maps became constellations of gods. The deeper context, perhaps the context linked to a lost planet, evaporated with time. If the survivors of such a world attempted to preserve their knowledge, they may have done so through teaching, symbolism, and encoded architecture. But as generations passed, the clarity of their memory faded, and the systems they introduced became vulnerable to reinterpretation, distortion, or destruction. And yet, certain anomalous traditions hint at a deeper origin. In Tibetan Bon tradition, the first teachers arrived from a sky realm called Olmo Lungring, bringing advanced knowledge to humanity. In Chinese Taoist lore, the Yellow Emperor ascends to a celestial kingdom after establishing civilization. In Zoroastrian cosmology, the Amesha Spenta are radiant beings who guide the shaping of the world. In early Christian Gnosticism, the Aeons are emanations from a higher realm that encourage human awakening. These traditions differ in theology, but share a structure: beings of knowledge arriving from elsewhere, guiding humanity, then withdrawing or becoming inaccessible. The question, then, is not whether these beings existed in literal or metaphorical form, but why these stories emerge everywhere, independently, as though rooted in a shared ancestral memory. Perhaps the answer lies in the moment of contact. Early humans, encountering a group of survivors from a shattered world, would not see refugees, they would see gods. The technology, knowledge, and presence of these beings would be incomprehensible but awe-inspiring. Over time, as their numbers declined and their tools failed, they would shift from influence to legend, then from legend to myth. And eventually, as the last of them faded, their story would dissolve into the collective amnesia of civilization. But memory leaves residue. It lingers in the sudden appearance of agriculture across multiple regions. It whispers through the improbable precision of ancient calendars. It hides in the unknown origins of sacred geometry. It resides in the sky maps carved into stone. It lives in the rituals that require certain frequencies, certain alignments, certain chants, echoes of a knowledge system too old to trace, and it pulses faintly in the persistent intuition that our history is incomplete. The possibility that another intelligent species once shared our solar system and touched our world does not diminish humanity's story. It expands it. It transforms civilization from an isolated miracle into a chapter within a larger cosmic tapestry. A chapter that survived the fall of another world. A chapter still searching for the pieces it lost. And as the narrative deepens, another question, so gentle it barely stirs the air, begins to form. If humanity carries fragments of a story older than Earth's civilizations, then what other fragments lie waiting, still buried beneath the layers of forgetting? There is a silence that settles over the mind when one contemplates the vastness of a missing history, an absence so large it begins to feel like a presence in itself. After following the threads of forgotten knowledge, celestial memories, and fractured legacies carried from a world that may have existed between Mars and Jupiter, the next veil lifts in an unexpected direction. Not upward toward the stars, nor downward into the earth, but inward, into the architecture of consciousness, myth, ritual, and the strange internal landscapes where memory becomes something more than recollection. Something inherited, embedded, and transmitted across time in ways that do not rely solely on stone, script, or spoken tradition. For if the survivors of a lost world once walked among early humans, if they taught, guided, or merely existed long enough for their presence to leave an impression, then some portion of that imprint would not linger in physical artifacts alone. It would echo in cognition, in symbolic systems, in the structures of mind that shape how cultures dream and imagine and perceive the cosmos. And so the next layer of the story does not begin with ruins or cosmologies, but with the persistent, almost haunting similarities in the inner worlds of ancient peoples. Similarities too coherent, too widespread to be dismissed as coincidence. One of the deepest of these echoes lies in the global tradition of spirit ascent, the notion that consciousness can climb a ladder, a mountain, or a series of realms to reach a higher plane. This motif emerges everywhere, in the shamanic soul flight of Siberia, the dream travel of Australian Aboriginal elders, the trance journeys of the Amazon, the Tibetan practices of inner illumination, the Sufi ascent through stations of the self. These traditions differ in technique, language, and purpose, yet they share a structural blueprint: stages, gates, guardians, thresholds, an upward motion accompanied by luminous beings or guiding presences. Some scholars interpret these parallels as evidence of shared neurobiology. Others see them as cultural diffusion from a single prehistoric source. Yet the breadth of the phenomenon suggests something deeper, not merely shared technique, but a shared memory of guidance. Early humans did not simply invent the idea of ascending into the sky. They remembered encounters that felt higher, brighter, beyond ordinary experience. If the survivors of a destroyed planet practiced states of heightened consciousness, or possessed tools that induce such states, then early humans, witnessing these abilities, might have translated them into ritual structures designed to imitate what they saw. Over time, the technology became metaphor, the training became initiation, the memory became myth. This possibility gains strength when one examines the peculiar consistency of initiation rituals across disparate cultures. In many traditions, the initiate enters darkness, caves, underground chambers, enclosed stone spaces, then emerges into light. Egyptian priests underwent ceremonies in subterranean chambers beneath temples before ascending to upper sanctuaries. Greek initiates at Eleusis descended into darkness before experiencing a revelation described as a light brighter than life. In the Andes, priests entered stone-lined corridors that produced acoustic resonances said to mimic the voice of the gods. Among the Yoruba, initiates entered enclosed huts, where the world disappeared before emerging into a new identity. These transitions, darkness to light, silence to sound, enclosure to expansion, do not merely symbolize spiritual growth. They mirror a structure: confinement followed by release, deactivation followed by activation. They resemble processes of calibration, transformation, or attunement. Concepts that resonate with accounts of beings who possessed technologies capable of interfacing with human consciousness. If the refugees of a lost world carried with them tools that interacted with perception or cognition, devices that used sound, vibration, or electromagnetic effects, early humans might have experienced these encounters as revelations. And as the devices failed or were lost, the physiological memory of the experience became ritual. This would explain why ancient initiation often focuses on the head, the spine, the breath, regions sensitive to frequency, resonance, and states of neural oscillation. Even more curious is the global obsession with serpentine imagery in contexts linked to knowledge, consciousness, or cosmic origins. Across Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent represents wisdom and descent from the heavens. In India, the coiled Kundalini serpent symbolizes latent spiritual energy. In Egypt, serpents guard the passage through the Duat. Among the Australian Aboriginal peoples, the rainbow serpent births creation. The serpent in the biblical garden grants knowledge rather than withholding it. In China, serpentine dragons embody power, transformation, and celestial order. This universal serpent motif has long puzzled scholars. But when one considers that beings from another world may have possessed technologies or biological traits unfamiliar to early humans, traits involving energy, light, movement, or even serpentine symbolism, the motif becomes less metaphorical and more mnemonic. A memory encoded into the deepest layer of cultural imagination. The next echo arises in the structure of sacred geometry, patterns that appear in rituals, artworks, megaliths, and cosmological diagrams across continents. From the mandalas of India to the labyrinths of Crete, from the flower of life patterns etched into Egyptian temples to the geometric petroglyphs of the American Southwest, a series of recurring shapes dominates early human symbolism. Circles within circles, spirals, tessellations, interlocking lines that map energy or movement. These forms are not random. They represent mathematical truths, ratios, harmonics, symmetries, that early humans should not have known. Yet they appear everywhere, sometimes carved into stone tens of thousands of years before the rise of cities. Philotactic spirals appear in Paleolithic cave art. Geometric grids adorn pottery thousands of years older than metallurgy. Even the simple act of dividing space into equal quadrants, a concept foundational to surveying, astronomy, and navigation, emerges fully formed in early cultures. If a lost civilization possessed advanced understanding of physics, mathematics, or energetic systems, their knowledge would have been incomprehensible to early humans. The easiest way to preserve such knowledge would be through geometry, an abstract language capable of surviving cultural collapse. The shape becomes the memory, the symbol becomes the teacher, and over millennia the original meaning fades, but the form persists, echoing a lost vocabulary of a forgotten world. It is in this context that we must consider the ancient obsession with sound, particularly low-frequency resonance. Sites such as Newgrange, Chavine, and the Hypogeum of Malta do not merely produce sound, they manipulate it in ways that alter consciousness. When a human voice is projected into certain chambers, the sound waves interact with the architecture to create standing waves that vibrate through the body. These vibrations can induce trance states, alter perception, and generate feelings of presence or connection. Experiments conducted in the hypogeum reveal that frequencies around 110 Hz produce strong neurological responses, activating regions of the brain associated with emotional processing and self-awareness. Similar effects are observed in Tibetan throat chanting, Gregorian plainsong, and indigenous drumming. These traditions are linked to healing, insight, and communication with other realms. Why would so many disparate cultures independently discover the same acoustic frequencies? Why would initiation ceremonies be designed around resonance? The simplest explanation is that they did not discover these frequencies independently. They inherited the knowledge from beings who already understood the interaction between sound and consciousness, beings who may have used sound-based tools, technologies, or communication methods far beyond early human understanding. The memory of these tools might survive only as a ritual, a faint echo of a technology that once shaped minds, guiding early humans through states of awareness that seem divine. This brings us to the global myth of the heavenly language, a tongue said to be spoken by gods, angels, or primordial beings. In Sumer, it is the Mi. In Egypt, the Medu Neter. In India, the Vak. In the Bible, the language spoken before Babel. In Polynesia, the language of the Atua. Among the Maya, the speech of the sky people. These traditions describe a mode of communication that is not merely verbal but vibrational, a transmission of meaning through resonance rather than articulation. Such descriptions align curiously with modern theories of nonverbal information exchange, from telepathy to frequency-based signaling. While unprovable, the consistency of these descriptions suggests that early humans witnessed a form of communication unlike their own, perhaps produced by technology, physiology, or a combination of both. As time passed, the memory of this language became myth. But the idea of a primordial tongue persists, an echo of something early humans could hear but not fully understand. A similar echo appears in the mythic motif of the Watchers, beings who observed humanity without fully intervening. In Mesopotamia, they are the Igigi and certain Anunnaki. In the Book of Enoch, they are the Watchers who descended in the days of Jared. In Greece, they become the Titans who watch over early humankind. In Egypt, the Shemsuhor observe epochs before the rise of the dynasties. Across Siberia, they appear as sky spirits who monitor human development. In parts of West Africa, they are the Nummo Watchers. These beings share several traits. They possess knowledge beyond human comprehension. They are associated with the sky or stars, and their primary role is observation. They guide without dominating, teach without conquering, and depart when humans begin to grow independently. This motif aligns with the idea that survivors of a shattered world may have attempted to guide early humanity gently, avoiding domination to prevent dependency. As their numbers dwindled and their tools weakened, observation became the only viable form of involvement. Over time, the Watchers disappeared, leaving behind only the memory of their presence. But if echoes of this lost world shaped ritual, myth, geometry, and consciousness, then the deepest echo of all may lie in humanity's relationship to the stars. From the earliest Paleolithic carvings to medieval manuscripts, humans are preoccupied with the heavens, not merely as a source of light or timekeeping, but as a place of origin. In Australia, ancestors come from the sky. In Polynesia, navigators say they follow the paths of their star ancestors. In Central Asia, shamans claim descent from beings who fell to Earth. In the American Southwest, storytellers speak of ancestors who emerged from the Pleiades. The Egyptians link their pharaohs to Orion and Sirius. The Maya align their cosmology to the movement of Venus and the Milky Way. The Dogon trace their origin to the Sirius system. This celestial self-identification is not an intellectual construct. It is a memory. Even the human body carries subtle hints of an inheritance not entirely terrestrial. The pineal gland, long a symbol of spiritual sight, responds to light frequencies beyond conscious perception. Human circadian rhythms align not only to daylight but to geomagnetic fluctuations. Ancient cultures knew this in intuitive ways. Egyptian iconography associates the pineal gland with the eye of Horus. Indian yogic traditions identify it with the Ajna chakra. The Greeks tie it to the seat of memory. These insights, expressed symbolically, suggest that early humans learned about consciousness and physiology from beings who understood the deeper structures of the mind. This inheritance is not supernatural, it is educational. But as with all things passed through the fragile vessel of culture, the context erodes. The beings become gods. The tools become rituals. The knowledge becomes symbol. The memory becomes myth. And yet something remains, a pulse of forgotten origin beating beneath the surface of human history. It is visible in the sudden emergence of complex astronomy, in the inexplicable precision of ancient calendars, in the anomalous alignment of global monuments, in the recurring geometric patterns found in caves and temples, in the worldwide obsession with ascent, resonance, serpents, trees, and watchers. These patterns are not random, they are fragments of a story too old to tell directly. And now, standing at the midpoint of this long journey, through forgotten epochs and broken legacies, one begins to sense the outline of something vast and unfinished, a story that did not begin on Earth, a story whose surviving participants walked among early humans, a story whose memory became the scaffolding of civilization. And yet, beneath all these echoes, a question deepens, quiet, persistent, unsettling in its gentleness. If the earliest layers of human consciousness carry traces of another world, then what other traces lie hidden still, waiting for someone patient enough to listen? There is a strange calm that settles in when the mind lingers long enough on the thought that our story may not have begun on Earth alone. Not a calm born of certainty, but one born of recognition, an almost instinctive sense that the deepest patterns of human civilization, the ones too consistent to attribute to coincidence, too widespread to attribute to diffusion, might be the residue of a chapter far older than our recorded history. By this point in the journey, after tracing the echoes of a shattered world, the lineage of knowledge that feels inherited rather than invented, and the subtle imprints left in myth, ritual, geometry, and consciousness, the narrative begins to edge toward something even more elusive, the traces of forgotten contact embedded not in culture or stone, but in the planet itself. For if another civilization once existed within our solar system, if the Anunnaki were not gods but survivors of a catastrophe that erased their world, then Earth would not have been a silent witness. The planet would bear the marks of their presence. Faint, degraded, unintentional perhaps, but real. Marks etched into landscapes, minerals, ice cores, orbital harmonics, places where geological time and human time overlap like two layers of a half-erased palimpsest. One of the first of these traces lies in the distribution of ancient mining sites. Across the world, in regions believed by archaeologists to have been untouched by complex civilizations, there exist mines far older than metallurgy itself, operations that required technical skill far beyond what early humans should have possessed. In southern Africa, the Ngwenya mines date back to at least 43,000 BCE, though some layers seem even older. The scale of excavation does not match the needs of Stone Age populations. The mining techniques appear systematic, targeted, focused on minerals such as hematite and specularit, materials that ancient cultures often treated as ritual pigments, but which could also serve technological or energetic purposes. Similarly, in the Great Lakes region of North America, copper pits attributed to prehistoric peoples suggest extraction on a scale far exceeding what small hunter-gatherer groups could have utilized. Tens of thousands of tons of copper appear to have been removed over millennia, yet no corresponding artifacts exist to explain where the bulk of it went. This absence has puzzled archaeologists for decades. Some speculate trade routes lost to time, others consider the possibility of erosion or burial, yet none of these explanations account for the sheer volume of the missing metal. What if these mines represent not the labour of early humans, but the remnants of an earlier presence, one that understood the properties of metals in ways not preserved in human tradition? If survivors of a destroyed planet carried with them technological needs or methods for processing minerals unfamiliar to early humans, they might have extracted materials in ways that later cultures could only dimly imitate. Even more curious are the ancient tunnels in Turkey, Peru, and Central Asia, kilometers of underground passages carved with remarkable smoothness. The Derinkuyu complex descends over 85 meters into the earth, containing ventilation systems, doors, and chambers capable of housing thousands. Traditional explanations point to hiding places built during volatile historical periods, yet the deepest levels appear far older than the societies that used them. Similar subterranean complexes found beneath the Andes show signs of advanced cutting techniques. Sharp edges, planed surfaces, geometric intersections. These underground worlds raise a quiet speculation. If a group of off-world survivors needed shelter from Earth's unstable climate, radiation, or predators, they may have built subterranean sanctuaries. Over time, as human populations expanded, these structures would be repurposed, mythologized, and eventually forgotten. Alongside the tunnels stands another anomaly: the inexplicable global distribution of vitrified stone. In Scotland, France, Turkey, and the Middle East, hill forts and structures show signs of stone walls melted by extreme heat. The temperatures required, well above 1000 degrees, exceed what wood fires or early metallurgy could achieve. The phenomenon remains unclassified: war, accident, ritual. Yet no consistent explanation exists, and while it is speculative to imagine advanced energy tools or catastrophic events linked to a lost civilization, the presence of vitrified structures cannot be ignored. They are real, they persist, and they hint at interactions with heat or energy sources unknown in early human history. Next come the orbital anomalies. Earth's rotation, axial tilt, and orbital precession follow predictable patterns, yet certain irregularities remain difficult to explain. The sudden shifts that mark the beginning and end of the Younger Dryas, changes too abrupt to be accounted for solely by terrestrial mechanisms, suggest an external influence. Some astrophysicists propose fragments of a large celestial body passing near Earth, altering climate and atmospheric chemistry. Others argue for solar outbursts or magnetic disruptions, but ancient records describe something else: a wandering star, a red visitor, a celestial serpent, a world-crossing body. In Babylonian astronomy, certain entries refer to an object whose orbit intersects Earth's at irregular intervals. In Greek cosmology, Phaethon's fall may symbolize the fragmentation of a celestial body. In Egyptian lore, the herald of change appears as a bright chaotic object that destabilizes the cosmos. The Maya codices include symbols that some interpret as passages of large bodies through Earth's sky. If the debris of a shattered planet once drifted through the inner solar system, ancient humans might have witnessed fragments passing overhead, glowing, burning, breaking apart. Such events would leave geological signatures: iridium spikes, microtectites, soot layers. Many such signatures exist. They simply lack a unified explanation. Another trace lies in the isotopic anomalies found at certain ancient sites. For instance, the sand at parts of the Sahara contains glass formed by temperatures far exceeding natural lightning strikes. In one region, the glass is so pure and evenly melted that some researchers compare it to the byproducts of controlled plasma events. Yet no crater exists, no volcano, no known cause. A similar anomaly appears at Mohenjo-Daro, where a portion of the ancient city shows signs of sudden intense heat, enough to fuse brick and crystallize minerals. These anomalies have inspired fringe theories for decades, some extravagant, some careless. But stripped of sensationalism, the underlying question remains quiet and persistent. What caused localized high-energy events thousands of years before the development of technologies capable of producing them? Even more unsettling are the anomalies embedded in human memory. Across cultures there exist uncanny legends of gods who did not merely descend from the sky, but left traces of their presence in earthly landscapes, craters identified as landing places, mountains said to have been carved by celestial craft, rivers described as scars from the paths of descending fire. These stories are poetic, metaphorical perhaps, and yet many align with geological features whose origins remain unexplained. In the American Southwest, the Hopi speak of sky beings who descended in shields of fire, creating patterns in the desert. In Australia, Dreamtime stories describe ancestors arriving in vehicles of light that altered the land. In India, the Vimana texts reference sky chariots whose landings left pits of glass. Even in Scandinavia, sagas describe boats not made by men landing on mountaintops, accompanied by thunder and wind. These stories can be interpreted symbolically as metaphors for celestial events, meteor impacts, or ritual imagination. But they could also represent the mythologized memory of encounters with remnants of a lost civilization, encounters filtered through the perceptions of early humans who lacked the vocabulary to describe what they saw. Yet perhaps the most subtle traces lie not in geological structures, myths, or artifacts, but in the strange convergence of human cognitive evolution. Human intelligence did not rise gradually. It leapt. Around 50,000 years ago, art, symbolic communication, ritual burial, navigation, and advanced toolmaking appeared almost simultaneously across different populations. Some call this the cognitive revolution. Others call it the Great Leap Forward. Paleoanthropologists struggle to explain why such rapid development occurred after hundreds of thousands of years of slow progress. One possibility is purely biological, a mutation, a neurological shift, an environmental pressure. But there exists another possibility, one rarely spoken of in the academic world, yet quietly acknowledged in comparative mythology, that early humans encountered beings whose mastery of language, symbol, coordination, and abstraction provided a model, a spark, a template for cognitive expansion. If survivors of a lost world lived among early humans, even briefly, their presence might have catalyzed rapid cognitive growth, not through genetic intervention necessarily, but through imitation, interaction, and exposure. Cultural contact can accelerate development faster than biological evolution. Even today, isolated tribes integrated into modern society leap decades of technological progress in a single generation. In deep prehistory, such contact would leave archaeological traces that appear miraculous. Sudden bursts of artistic sophistication, new tool industries, symbolic behavior emerging almost overnight. These are precisely the patterns found in the archaeological record. Another domain of subtle evidence lies in the symbolic languages of ancient peoples, languages that seem designed to encode multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example, function not only as phonetic symbols but as conceptual diagrams. Sumerian cuneiform expresses entire ideas in compressed wedges. The I Ching encodes binary mathematics. The runic systems of northern Europe encode cosmology through angular strokes. The Mayan glyphs integrate astronomy with syntax. These systems did not evolve from crude forms. They appear fully formed, already complex. If they preserve the residue of an earlier knowledge system, one carried by refugees of a lost world, then their complexity is not miraculous, but inherited. What then of the Earth itself? What imprints would remain of beings who crossed between worlds, who lived here long enough for their story to dissolve into myth? Perhaps the answer lies in the planet's anomalies, those features that do not fit neatly into geological or archaeological categories. The Earth's poles hold layers of ice containing atmospheric changes that align with periods of ancient upheaval. Strange magnetic anomalies appear in regions associated with prehistoric myths. Unexplained electromagnetic hotspots coincide with ancient sacred sites. Subtle traces of heavy isotopes appear in soils with no known natural source. Even scarcer, but still present, are reports of unusual materials, metallic spheres discovered deep in geological layers, stone spheres polished with impossible perfection, objects that seem manufactured yet lack a clear cultural context. These findings are often dismissed as natural formations or hoaxes. Some likely are, but others remain stubbornly unexplained. The Klerksdorp spheres, for instance, perfectly grooved iron objects found in 3-billion-year-old rock, remain a geological puzzle, not evidence of technology, but evidence of anomalous processes. The reluctance to consider these anomalies in a broader context stems not from lack of imagination, but from the absence of a framework. If one assumes humanity arose in isolation, then every anomaly must be terrestrial. But if one entertains the possibility of contact with survivors of a lost world, these anomalies become pieces, fragments of a narrative too large to fit into conventional history. Yet the most haunting trace of all may lie in the persistent human intuition that something is missing, something fundamental, something half-remembered, the sense that our story began with a loss rather than a beginning. This intuition appears in myths of a golden age, a paradise lost, a homeland forgotten, a world before the world. It appears in philosophical traditions that describe humanity as a species in exile. It appears in spiritual traditions speaking of a fall, a rupture, a descent. It appears in the vague ache humans feel when contemplating the stars, the strange mingling of wonder and homesickness. Perhaps this feeling is metaphorical. Perhaps it is biological. Or perhaps it is cultural memory. Echoes of ancestors who once lived under a different sky, on a different world, and who carried the memory of that world into their new home. And so, standing at this threshold of geological traces, symbolic residues, and cognitive anomalies, one begins to sense that the story of the Anunnaki, stripped of superstition, freed from sensationalism, grounded in subtle evidence, may not be a story of gods who ruled humanity, but of survivors who left quiet impressions on a young civilization. Impressions that still pulse beneath the surface of our world, and as this thought lingers, another reflection rises, soft, persistent, and unsettling in its stillness. If the earth bears scars of a forgotten encounter, then what else might it be hiding, waiting for the world to remember? There is a moment in this long descent through forgotten ages when the mind begins to recognize a strange rhythm, an oscillation between presence and absence, revelation and erasure, contact and withdrawal. It is as though the deeper layers of human history follow a pulse, a kind of breath, drawn in the shadow of something older than civilization itself. After tracing echoes in geology, consciousness, architecture and ritual, the next veil rises over a domain even more elusive, the hidden history of Earth's oceans, deserts and buried continents, places where time folds differently, preserving secrets the land has already forgotten. For if survivors of a lost world once walked the earth, their footprints would not lie only in caves or temples. They would lie beneath the waves, across drowned coastlines, on plateaus where oceans once stood low, and beneath sand where winds covered entire eras. Our planet is not stable. It breathes with the rise and fall of sea levels, the drifting of tectonic plates and the shifting of climates. And in this restless motion lies the quiet possibility that the oldest chapters of our story lie not where we have looked, but where we have not. The first of these forgotten geographies lies beneath the oceans, a world submerged at the end of the last ice age, when rising seas consumed continental shelves. Over 20 million square kilometers of land vanished beneath water, including the populated coastlines where early humans likely lived. Archaeology barely touches these regions, not because they lack importance, but because they are inaccessible. Yet scattered discoveries offer hints of what may lie hidden. Off the coast of India, the submerged city of Dwarka reveals stone structures and grid patterns that challenge the supposed timeline of civilization. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni monument bears terraces, platforms and stair-like features whose origin remains debated. Off the coast of Malta, cart ruts carved into limestone continue beneath the sea, extending into submerged landscapes older than any known settlement. These anomalies are often explained as natural formations or later constructions, yet their distribution along ancient coastlines suggests a deeper story, one in which early humans or pre-human cultures built along the shores of a world now drowned. If survivors of a lost planet settled near coasts, seeking temperate climates, stable food sources, or vantage points for observing the heavens, the traces of their presence would lie underwater, preserved in silence. Further evidence of such hidden geographies lies along the North Sea, where Doggerland once connected Britain to Europe. This vast region supported forests, rivers, and human settlements for thousands of years before flooding. Archaeologists have discovered tools, bones, and remnants of structures pulled from fishing nets. Yet Doggerland is only one of many. Sunderland in Southeast Asia, Beringia between Russia and Alaska, the Persian Gulf Oasis, each a lost world that may have hosted cultures far older than those recorded on land. What is haunting is not the existence of these submerged regions, but their absence in cultural memory. Only fragments survive, stories of cities swallowed by water, of lands that sank, of people forced to flee. These tales appear in Greek myths of Atlantis, Indian accounts of Dvaraka, Polynesian legends of Hawaii, and Aboriginal narratives of drowned coastlines remembered for over 10,000 years. These memories do not describe gradual sea level rise but sudden catastrophe, waves that consumed everything, lights that vanished, stars that trembled. Such stories align uncannily with the aftermath of a cosmic event, an impact, a debris field, or the gravitational disturbance of a passing celestial body. If fragments of a shattered world passed near Earth at the end of the last ice age, they could have triggered rapid melting, tsunamis, and climatic chaos. Survivors, both human and non-human, would have fled inland, carrying memories that eventually became mythology. The next hidden landscape lies not beneath water but beneath sand. Deserts are deceptively young. The Sahara, for instance, was once a green savanna filled with lakes, rivers, and settlements. Rock art in the Sahara depicts giraffes, cattle, and boats, an impossible image for a desert unless one remembers that this land was once fertile. But beneath the dunes lie remnants of cities, stone circles, and road networks buried for thousands of years. Satellite imagery reveals geometric patterns, rectilinear foundations, and circular enclosures across regions believed uninhabited in early history. These structures challenge traditional chronology, not because they represent advanced technology, but because they suggest a cultural complexity that predates known civilizations by millennia. If remnants of a lost world survivors built settlements in North Africa before the desert formed, those ruins would now lie beneath sand deposited over thousands of years. Other deserts hold similar enigmas. In the Gobi, ancient walls extend for kilometers, built of stone and compacted earth. Their origins remain unknown. In the Arabian Peninsula, mysterious desert kites form massive geometric traps visible only from the sky, yet built by cultures not believed to have mastered aerial perspectives. In Peru's Atacama, the geoglyphs of Chug Chug stretch for kilometers, etched into the earth long before the rise of the Nazca. These desert structures may represent attempts to preserve knowledge or alignments inherited from a tradition far older than the cultures that built them, perhaps echoes of astronomical or energetic systems known to refugees from another world. But the next concealed landscape lies even deeper, beneath the ice. Antarctica, now a frozen wasteland, once supported forests, lakes, and rivers during the Eocene epoch. Fossils of trees, reptiles, and even marsupials testify to a world radically different from today's. While mainstream science acknowledges this ancient climate, what remains unexplored is the possibility that human or pre-human cultures may have reached Antarctica during periods of lower ice coverage. Certain ancient maps, such as the Piri Reis map of 1513, appear to depict portions of Antarctica's coastline without ice. Scholars debate the accuracy of these maps, yet their details suggest an origin older than the navigational tools available at the time. If such maps reflect inherited knowledge from an earlier forgotten epoch, they hint at exploration or contact long before recorded civilization. Survivors of a lost world, possessing geographic knowledge from their home planet or from interplanetary travel, may have mapped Earth's polar regions during a time when they were accessible. And then there are the hidden mountains. Across the world, mountains house legends of beings who withdrew from humanity, retreating to high places where the air thins and the stars feel closer. In Tibet, Shambhala lies hidden beyond icy peaks. In the Andes, the gods dwell on mountain tops. In Japan, the mountain kami teach and then disappear. In Greece, Olympus hosts immortal beings. In the Caucasus, ancient sanctuaries carved into cliffs suggest a culture operating beyond the ordinary reach of early humans. Mountains serve not only as metaphors for isolation, but as literal refuges. If refugees of a shattered planet needed to survive in environments inaccessible to human populations, they might have chosen high altitudes, colder, more stable, protected from flooding, and aligned with celestial observation. Over centuries, these enclaves would dwindle, leaving behind only stone structures, mythic memories, and the faint intuition that the mountains hold secrets older than the civilizations in the valleys below. Yet perhaps the most haunting hidden landscape lies not outside humanity, but within its own cultural silences, moments where history seems to bend away from something it nearly reveals. Consider the peculiar global shift around 3000 BCE, when multiple cultures underwent sudden standardization of their myths. The Sumerians codified their pantheon, the Egyptians formalized their temple rituals, the Indus Valley standardized iconography. China began its dynastic era. The Americas saw the rise of early ceremonial centers. This worldwide consolidation of belief appears abrupt, as though guided by a sudden loss of older, more fluid traditions. It's as though something disappeared around this time, something that had kept myths dynamic, unwritten, adaptable. When that something vanished, cultures rushed to preserve whatever fragments remained, freezing stories into fixed forms. What if the disappearance of survivors from another world, whether through death, assimilation, or final withdrawal, triggered a global attempt to preserve memory before it dissolved? This hypothesis gains weight when examining the concept of forbidden knowledge, stories, techniques, or insights that ancient cultures guarded fiercely. In Mesopotamia, the powers of civilization, were restricted. In Egypt, the books of Thoth were hidden. In Greece, the Orphic mysteries concealed cosmic secrets. In India, the Vedas were guarded by memory alone for millennia. In the Americas, certain rituals could be transmitted only through vision quests or ecstatic states. What knowledge required such caution? Why did so many cultures fear its uncontrolled spread? Perhaps the knowledge was not dangerous but incomplete, fragments of a system whose full context was lost when its original teachers disappeared. Without that context, the fragments might mislead, destabilize, or overwhelm. If the survivors of a lost world taught early humans principles of astronomy, mathematics, energy, or consciousness, but their numbers dwindled before they could complete the transmission, the remaining knowledge would become sacred, restricted, partially understood. This would explain why advanced insights appear in ancient texts wrapped in metaphor, myth, or ritual. A similar pattern emerges in the world's oldest creation stories. Nearly every culture describes humanity being shaped, taught, or uplifted by beings who depart when their work is done. These stories are often dismissed as mythic, yet they may represent encoded history, early humanity interpreting the arrival of a more advanced group through the lens of metaphor and reverence. But if such beings existed, and if they ultimately disappeared, where did they go? Some myths speak of departure by sky, others of underground retreats, others of ascension to hidden realms. A few suggest a tragic end, conflict, illness, internal division. None tell the full story. But their consistency implies that something changed, abruptly, decisively. Perhaps the survivors of a lost world dwindled over generations, unable to adapt fully to Earth. Without access to their original resources or technologies, they may have gradually blended into human populations or died without leaving descendants. Or perhaps they succeeded in preserving a small remnant, sealed knowledge, hidden vaults, encoded messages waiting for a future civilization to rediscover. This possibility leads to one of the most haunting domains of all, the existence of structures beneath Earth's surface that defy conventional explanation. Deep below Cappadocia lie tunnels too extensive for defensive purposes alone. Beneath Andean plateaus lie labyrinths carved from hard bedrock. In Egypt, beneath the Saqqara Plateau, the Serapeum houses massive stone sarcophagi, whose purpose remains unknown. The Osirian at Abydos lies at a depth inconsistent with dynastic construction. Beneath the Sphinx lies a chamber long rumoured but only recently confirmed by ground-penetrating radar. These structures may not represent alien technology, but they may represent the legacy of a culture that inherited techniques and tools from a more advanced source. Tools that later eroded, rusted, disappeared, leaving only the stone impressions of their existence. Even the Great Pyramids, with their mathematically precise alignment, harmonic proportions, and internal resonance chambers, appear as though designed according to a blueprint more sophisticated than the engineering capabilities of their contemporaries. Their builders may have been human, but their model may have been inherited, a memory of structures seen elsewhere, on a world no longer present. And yet, the most intriguing trace of a lost world's influence lies not in structures or myths, but in a subtle shift that occurs across the globe around the same epochs, the sudden emergence of time. Before writing, before agriculture, before cities, time was marked by changing seasons, movements of animals, and migratory cycles. But suddenly, in the earliest civilizations, time becomes structured, divided into cycles, tracked with precision, integrated into ritual and governance. Calendars emerge with astonishing accuracy. the Sumerian, Egyptian, Mayan, Chinese, and Indus. Calendars all reflect advanced astronomical understanding. Such precision does not arise from raw observation alone, it reflects inherited frameworks. Early humans learned to track time not because they needed to, but because someone else did. Someone for whom cosmic cycles held meaning, perhaps due to their homeworld's orbital characteristics. If the survivors of a lost planet carried with them a temporal system calibrated to their world's year or cycle, they may have introduced concepts of timekeeping that early humans adopted and adapted. This would explain why ancient calendars often measure cycles not relevant to earthly life. Venus transits, precessional motion, lunar nodes. These cycles are relevant not to agriculture, but to celestial navigation or interplanetary travel. Such knowledge, once introduced, faded into ritual and religion, its original purpose lost. Now, at this juncture in the narrative, one begins to sense that the Anunnaki story, beneath its mythic veneer, reflects a chain of broken transmissions. Not a grand dominion of gods over humans, but a fragile attempt by survivors to preserve fragments of a world that no longer exists. And beneath all these scattered hints lies a single quiet truth. Earth is not merely a cradle of humanity, but a palimpsest, layered with forgotten geographies, silent ruins, mythic memories, and geological scars, each an echo of a larger story, one stretching back to a world shattered long before human memory began. A story not yet fully remembered, a story still unfolding, a story still calling softly from beneath the waves, the sand, the ice, and the silent places between. And as this realization settles into the mind like dusk along the horizon, another question stirs, gentle, almost sorrowful. If so much of the past remains hidden, then how much of what we call the beginning is merely the middle of a much older tale waiting to be rediscovered? There is a kind of stillness that settles as the path winds deeper into the forgotten corridors of time. A stillness heavy not with answers, but with the growing awareness that humanity has been walking along the edge of a buried truth for far longer than it realizes. After exploring submerged coastlines, vanished deserts, encoded myths, and the hidden architectures of the mind, the next layer surfaces not in stone nor water nor ice, but in the strange continuity of symbols, structures, and stories that appear across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. It is here, in this intricate web of convergence, that the imprint of a lost world becomes most sharply visible. A world whose memory ripples through history, not as a shout but as a whisper. This whisper speaks most clearly in the oldest symbols, those that lie at the foundation of language, cosmology, and ritual. One such symbol is the spiral. It appears in Paleolithic caves carved into stone tens of thousands of years ago. It appears in Celtic monuments as though marking entrances to other realms. It appears in Andean textiles, African rock art, Polynesian tattoos, and the petroglyphs of the American Southwest. The spiral represents motion, life, cycles, energy, interpretations as diverse as the cultures that preserved it. Yet what makes the spiral so intriguing is not its ubiquity, but its sophistication. The double spiral in particular encodes rotational symmetry and counterforces, concepts foundational to orbital mechanics. The triple spiral, or triskelion, embodies dynamic balance found in fluid dynamics. These symbols, carved long before humans built cities, reflect an awareness of natural patterns too abstract for survival-based cultures to invent spontaneously. They feel inherited, as though ancient peoples remembered a system of knowledge no longer fully understood. The same is true of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. This symbol appears in Egypt, India, Greece, the Americas, and parts of Africa. Its meaning shifts between cultures, eternity, unity, cycles, but its structure remains the same. It mirrors certain cosmological models, energy loops, or even conceptual representations of closed systems. If survivors of a lost world carried with them symbolic frameworks to describe energy or cosmic cycles, the Ouroboros may be one of the last remnants. A similar convergence occurs in the motif of the sacred center, a concept so fundamental it shapes cities, temples, and cosmologies across the world. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats stand at the center, linking earth and sky. In Egypt, temple complexes align to cardinal directions, with sanctuaries placed at the heart. In China, the Forbidden City mirrors the cosmological center. Among the Maya, ceremonial plazas reflect cosmic hubs. In India, the mandala depicts the universe radiating from a central point. This shared architectural grammar suggests a template, one taught rather than invented. Early civilizations did not simply build, they remembered. Their sacred centers may have mirrored structures or principles observed on another world, then adapted to Earth. Over time, the original purpose faded, leaving only the form, a center connected to the heavens. Another whisper lies in the myth of world teachers, figures who appear suddenly in the earliest traditions, bearing knowledge, order, or codes of conduct. Among the Sumerians, these figures include Enki, Enlil, and Ninmah. In Egypt, Thoth and Osiris fulfill similar roles. In India, the rishis transmit cosmic principles. In China, Fuxi and Nuwa guide humanity towards civilization. In Polynesia, Maui pulls islands from the sea and reforms nature. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha bring mathematics, timekeeping, and agriculture. These figures appear in the earliest layers of myth, not as metaphors, but as civilizers. They arrive fully formed. They teach systems too complex to arise spontaneously. They depart suddenly, leaving behind knowledge without context. The global consistency of these stories suggests not diffusion, but independent recollection of encounters with advanced beings, encounters reframed through mythic memory. Another convergence lies in the use of 12 months, 12 gods, 12 zodiac signs, 12 sacred measures, 12 stages of initiation, 12 tribes, 12 cycles. This number appears so consistently that it transcends cultural coincidence. It resembles the adaptation of a system tied to orbital cycles different from Earth's, perhaps the year length or structural logic of a lost planet. Even more curious is the number 72, present in ancient calendars, mythology, and cosmology. It reflects the rate of precession, 72 years per degree of Earth's axial shift. Ancient cultures across the world encoded this number, despite lacking instruments capable of measuring precession. How? Unless the number was inherited from a tradition that understood precession long before humans did. Perhaps a tradition developed on a world with more severe orbital variations or longer periods of celestial observation. Another persistent convergence appears in the depiction of beings with elongated skulls, a motif found in Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Andes, Melanesia, and parts of Africa. Some argue these skulls result from intentional cranial modification. Yet the question remains, why shape the head? Why imitate a form not naturally human? The most plausible reason is memory, an attempt to resemble a revered group whose appearance differed from humans, perhaps subtly but notably. If survivors of a lost world possess distinctive cranial features, whether due to biology or adaptation, early humans may have adopted cranial deformation to emulate them. Yet the most striking convergence lies in the oldest myths of human origins. Many cultures claim humans were shaped or guided by beings not entirely of Earth. These stories appear not only in creation myths, but in early epic traditions, often preserved in poetic or symbolic form. The Sumerian texts describe humanity being shaped for the tasks of the gods, though this may reflect cultural framing rather than literal purpose. In Greek myth, Prometheus crafts humankind and bestows fire, symbolic of knowledge. In certain African traditions, sky people mold the first humans from clay or seed. In Mesoamerican lore, humans undergo multiple creations before being completed by divine intervention. In India, beings from the heavens participate in shaping the early world. These stories, stripped of theological language, reflect an older pattern, the belief that human culture emerged through contact rather than pure evolution, not as an imposition, but as a meeting, a convergence of two worlds. The next whisper lies not in myth, but in knowledge systems, especially astronomy. The accuracy of ancient astronomy is one of the most persistent enigmas in human history. The Maya calculated the synodic cycle of Venus to near-perfect accuracy. The Babylonians tracked Jupiter and Saturn with sophisticated mathematical techniques. The Egyptians aligned temples to stellar risings with precision that accounts for precession. The Dogon possess detailed knowledge of the Sirius system that unsettles astrophysicists, though interpretations vary. Such precision cannot be explained by observation alone. Ancient skywatchers lacked telescopes, yet they possessed models of celestial mechanics, aligned with modern understanding. If survivors of a lost planet brought with them knowledge of celestial cycles essential to interplanetary navigation, early humans may have inherited frameworks they could not fully explain. This would also explain why ancient cultures described the sky not as distant, but as familiar, mapped, structured, navigable. To a terrestrial culture, the heavens are distant. To a culture that once travelled between worlds, they are home. Another domain where whispers converge is the world of ancient sound technology. Many early cultures developed instruments, chants, and resonant structures capable of producing harmonic frequencies associated with altered states. Tibetan singing bowls, Australian didgeridoos, Andean flutes, Siberian drums, Vedic chants, all produce acoustic effects that interact with human physiology. Archaeologists have discovered flutes in Slovenia dating back over 40,000 years, capable of producing complex scales. The caves of Lascaux and Altamira were painted in chambers with resonant acoustics, suggesting a connection between sound and ritual experience. If the survivors of a lost world possessed tools or techniques based on frequency, vibration, or resonance, early humans may have attempted to imitate these effects through instruments and architecture. Over time, the purpose of these practices became spiritual rather than scientific, but the form endured. The next convergence lies in global flood myths. Nearly every culture on Earth describes a great deluge that destroyed earlier worlds. These stories are not vague. They include specific details: suddenness, global scale, survival on high grounds, the presence of teachers before or after the flood. Geological evidence supports massive sea level rises around 12,000 years ago. But what is intriguing is how many flood myths include celestial precursors: a star falling, a cosmic battle, a bright object in the sky, a sound like thunder from above. These descriptions match the effects of incoming debris, either comet fragments or remnants of a destroyed planet. The trauma of such an event would have shattered cultures, erased knowledge, and fractured contact between humanity and any off-world survivors living on Earth. The flood myths may represent the moment when the memory of a lost world slipped beyond reach. A deeper whisper lies in the theme of forbidden knowledge, a motif appearing in traditions across the globe. In Mesopotamia, the me-contained knowledge humanity was not ready to receive. In Egypt, Thoth's books held secrets too powerful for ordinary minds. In India, certain Vedic knowledge was restricted. In the Bible, the tree of knowledge marks a threshold humanity was not meant to cross. In Greek myth, Prometheus is punished for giving humans fire. In the Americas, certain rituals were limited to trained initiates. What connects these stories is the idea that knowledge came from outside, and that it had consequences. Not because it was inherently dangerous, but because it lacked context. Knowledge introduced without full transmission becomes distorted. Perhaps the survivors of a lost world attempted to teach early humans certain principles, but their withdrawal or disappearance left humanity with fragments, half-understood systems later labelled forbidden. One must also consider the curious phenomenon of ancient golden ages, periods described in myth as times of peace, longevity, and harmony. The Greeks placed their golden age at the dawn of humanity. The Indians describe Satya Yuga as a time when beings of great purity lived among humans. The Egyptians speak of the Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods walked the earth. The Sumerians list long-lived kings before the flood. What is striking is that these golden ages often end with a catastrophe, suggesting a fall, a loss, or a departure. These traditions may preserve memories of an era when survivors of a lost world still lived alongside early humans, an era that ended when contact diminished. Yet perhaps the most haunting convergence lies in the pattern of withdrawal. Across world mythology, teachers depart, civilizers vanish, gods retreat, sky beings return to the heavens or descend into hidden realms. This departure is nearly always described as reluctant, sorrowful, or incomplete. Someone leaves before the story is fully told. Why? Perhaps because they could not stay. Perhaps because their numbers dwindled. Perhaps because their technology failed. Perhaps because their presence became disruptive to emerging human cultures. Or perhaps because Earth was never meant to be a permanent refuge, only a temporary home. This sense of unfinished work appears in myths that speak of a promise to return. Quetzalcoatl will come again, Osiris will rise, the Hopi await the return of the Elder Brothers, the Dogon foresee the return of the Nommo, even the Sumerian texts hint at cycles, epochs when certain beings become visible or active. But whether or not such returns ever occurred, the memory endures. It endures not as prophecy, but as longing. Longing for completion, longing for the missing chapter, longing for a story interrupted, and this longing appears not only in myth, but in art. The oldest human artworks, hands on cave walls, animals etched in stone, abstract symbols, speak of a world where humans were searching, reaching, sensing something just beyond memory. They depict not just survival, but connection. Humans reaching towards something larger. One can see it in the Shigir idol of Russia, over 12,000 years old, carved with geometric patterns whose purpose remains unknown. In the Göbekli Tepe pillars, animals and symbols aligned as though part of a cosmic message. In the Venus figurines, representing not bodies but archetypes. In the ancient masks that blur human and non-human forms. In the petroglyphs that depict star beings, sky shapes, and ladder-like structures. These symbols reflect a worldview shaped by more than nature, shaped by memory. And now, as the journey approaches its final threshold, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Humanity's oldest layers are haunted by echoes not of gods, but of a lost civilization whose survivors carried knowledge, geometry, ritual, and memory into a world unprepared to receive them fully. Their presence flickered across early human history, teaching, guiding, retreating, before fading into myth. And the traces they left behind still shimmer, faint but persistent, awaiting recognition. And as this realization settles like dusk across the mind, another question rises, soft, uncertain, and strangely tender. If humanity carries the memory of a lost world in its oldest symbols, myths, and structures, then what waits in the final layer of this long-forgotten story, still hidden beneath the last veil of time? There is a peculiar hush that settles in the mind when the narrative approaches its deepest and final layer, a hush like the breath held between tides, when the sea has drawn back but has not yet returned. By now, after journeying through echoes in stone, memory, myth, geology, consciousness, language, and the living scars of Earth itself, one begins to sense that the story of humanity and the story of the lost world behind the Anunnaki are not parallel tales at all, but interwoven strands of the same tapestry. And in this final descent, the thread winds toward the most elusive domain of all, the shadowed spaces where the past has been intentionally obscured, reshaped, or overwritten, not only by time and catastrophe, but by human hands. For if there was once a world that shattered, and if its survivors walked among early humans, then the traces they left would not remain untouched forever. They would pass into memory, into ritual, into symbol, but also into systems of power, belief, and knowledge. And those who later shaped civilization's story might have found it necessary, or tempting, to recast, diminish, or conceal the deeper origins of humanity, not through malice necessarily, but through the natural instinct of institutions to preserve authority, continuity, and narrative control. Thus begins the most delicate layer, the quiet suggestion that large portions of our historical record may be curated reflections rather than complete accounts. One of the earliest indications of such shaping lies in the transition from oral tradition to written record. Oral traditions across the world preserve tales of sky beings, cosmic teachers, world cycles, and vanished epochs. These stories are rich, fluid, multi-layered. But once writing emerged, first in Sumer, then Egypt, then other centres, myths became subject to codification. The very act of writing fixed stories in place, removing their fluidity. Entire cosmologies were compressed into linear narratives. Metaphors became doctrines. Symbolic stories became literal interpretations, or were discarded entirely. In Mesopotamia, The earliest cuneiform tablets reference older sources now lost, tablets from before the flood, from the first time, from the wisdom of those who came before. Yet as political structures hardened, certain myths were prioritized, reshaped to legitimize dynasties. Knowledge that once flowed freely between priesthoods and initiates became compartmentalized. The earliest priest-kings claimed descent from the Anunnaki, but later dynasties shifted this connection to metaphors, downplaying any literal memory. A similar pattern emerges in Egypt. Early traditions speak of the Shemsu Hor, followers of Horus, who ruled for thousands of years before the pharaohs. These beings are described neither as gods nor as ordinary humans, but as dynasties evolved, references to these predecessors became ritualized, hidden within temple walls accessible only to the highest priests. Later eras recast them as divine archetypes rather than historical beings, and by the time Greek historians visited Egypt, much of the earliest memory had already become symbolic. In the Indus Valley, an enigmatic combination of script and iconography suggests a tradition older than the Vedic period, possibly one that preserved echoes of astronomical or cosmological origins. But as new cultures rose, older symbols were absorbed, reinterpreted, or obscured. The original context dissolved. In China, ancient dynastic chronicles reference the sons of the sky and immortals who taught the early people, yet these accounts were later rewritten by scholars under Confucian influence, who sought to remove supernatural elements and impose moral order on cosmology. In Mesoamerica, the memory of Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, civilizers who arrived after Cataclysm, survived only in fragments after the arrival of conquerors who systematically destroyed codices, temples, and oral histories. In each case, the process is the same. Complexity gives way to simplification, memory gives way to narrative control, myth gives way to doctrine, and in the process whatever remnants of a lost world's influence remained became buried beneath layers of reinterpretation. This is not conspiracy, it is a pattern of history. Empires rewrite pasts, priesthoods guard knowledge, elites reshape stories to serve their needs, and civilizations emerging from trauma tend to compress their past, shedding the parts too strange to reconcile. But the most haunting aspect is not that stories were reshaped. It is that certain types of stories were consistently softened, minimized, or brushed aside across cultures. Stories of beings who came from elsewhere, stories of cycles before the known world, stories of teachers whose form was not entirely human, stories of knowledge that arrived fully formed, stories of contact interrupted by catastrophe. These narratives survive, but often only at the fringes of official tradition, as allegory, folklore, or esoteric doctrine. Another thread emerges in the rise of monotheistic and imperial worldviews. As centralized religions established themselves, older cosmologies containing memories of the Anunnaki or similar beings were reinterpreted. The gods became angels or demons, the watchers became fallen, the teachers became tricksters, rebels, or metaphors. The cosmic cycles became symbolic rather than literal. In each case, the older memory was not erased, it was recast. This recasting can be seen in the Book of Enoch, which describes watchers descending from the sky and teaching forbidden arts. But later traditions transformed these beings into metaphors for spiritual downfall. Similarly, Zoroastrian texts reference star beings who shaped the early world, but later interpretations softened these references into purely moral allegories. Even Greek philosophy, early on filled with cosmic lore from Egypt and Mesopotamia, eventually shifted toward rationalized interpretations, obscuring the mythic memory beneath abstraction. Yet beneath these layers, a strange consistency remains. The earliest myths of contact are the richest, most detailed, least filtered. As they move forward through time, they grow more symbolic, diffused, and restricted. This suggests that something in humanity's earliest epochs carried a clarity that later eras sought either to protect or to diminish. Another layer of intentional shaping lies in the institutional control of astronomical knowledge. Early priesthoods around the world preserved detailed star charts, precessional cycles, and cosmic calendars, knowledge inherited from even earlier traditions. But as societies centralized, this knowledge became restricted. Only select individuals were permitted to learn the oldest astronomical cycles. Some calendars were declared forbidden for public use. Certain stars were reserved for elite rituals, and when reforms occurred, as in the transition from lunar to solar calendars, older cosmic cycles were quietly removed. Why? Perhaps because the knowledge no longer aligned with the worldview of the civilization. Perhaps because it threatened political structures, or perhaps because the deeper significance of the cycles had been forgotten, significance that may have been clearer to the survivors of a lost world. A similar pattern appears in language. Many ancient languages contain roots, symbols, or structures that resist clear etymological tracing. The Sumerian language isolate, the mysterious script of the Indus Valley, the undeciphered Rongo-Rongo of Easter Island, the Proto-Elamite script, the Phaistos disk. These anomalies suggest remnants of systems older than the cultures that used them, systems that may reflect the influence of teachers whose linguistic frameworks did not fully align with human evolution. Later civilizations, lacking context, recast these languages as sacred, magical, or forbidden. And then there are the lost records themselves, texts known to have existed but no longer available, the Sumerian tablets referencing earlier sources, the Egyptian scrolls described by priests but never recovered, the Chaldean histories, the Mayan codices burned, the Alexandrian archives consumed by fire, the Olmec records erased, Chinese dynastic chronicles purged during political reform. Each loss removes a piece of a larger puzzle. Each destruction narrows the timeline. Each erasure quiets a voice that might have spoken of worlds beyond Earth. But the most intriguing layer of intentional obscuring lies not in texts or temples, but in the shape of civilization itself. When one examines the earliest centers of culture, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, one notices a pattern. Each emerges abruptly, fully formed, with systems that appear inherited. Yet within a few centuries each undergoes consolidation, standardization, simplification. Rituals become formulaic, myths become codified, knowledge systems lose their fluidity. This shift reflects a transition from inheritance to self-containment. Once the memory of external contact faded, cultures turned inward, reshaping their stories to reflect human-centered origins. This restructuring may also have been defensive. Traumatic memories of global catastrophe, flood, fire, sky upheaval, may have pushed emerging civilizations to create narratives of stability, continuity, and control. The memory of a world destroyed may have been too destabilizing to preserve. Thus, the earliest, richest layers of memory were softened, ritualized, mythologized, and ultimately hidden. And yet, beneath this intentional reshaping, deeper hints remain. Hints that the story of contact did not end entirely with departure. Some traditions describe cycles of return, periods when star beings, teachers, or watchers reappear briefly to guide or warn. These accounts are rare, fragmented, often esoteric, but they persist. In certain Tibetan traditions, luminous beings are said to descend during specific astronomical alignments. In Aboriginal lore, sky ancestors return to inspect sacred sites. In Polynesia, navigators speak of star guides that appear at pivotal moments. In Mesoamerica, prophets claim Quetzalcoatl appeared in dreams long after his departure. These fragments suggest that contact may not have been a single event, but a diminishing sequence, intermittent, weakening, fading as the survivors of the lost world dwindled. The final traces of such beings may lie in peculiar archaeological anomalies, skeletons with unusual proportions, isolated DNA markers with no clear lineage, objects found far from any known trade routes. None conclusive, but collectively suggestive. And yet the deepest whisper of all lies in the human condition itself, our sense of exile, our intuition of a story interrupted. Across cultures, humanity expresses an ache, a yearning for a home it cannot name. Myths speak of a paradise lost. Philosophers speak of a fall. Mystics speak of forgetting. Poets speak of longing for the stars. Even modern individuals look upward with a sense that something is missing. Perhaps this feeling is not metaphorical. Perhaps it is inherited memory, a trace of a world that once existed in the same sunlit system we now call home. If so, then humanity is not merely the child of Earth, but the heir to a cosmic wound, one that shaped our ancestors not through conquest but through solace. The Anunnaki, beneath layers of myth, may not have been gods at all but refugees, tired, grieving, determined to preserve what they could. Their legacy may not lie in power, but in guidance. Not in dominion, but in memory. Not in conquest, but in the quiet hope that the knowledge of their world might help this one avoid the same fate. And as this long journey through forgotten time comes to its final turn, one begins to recognize that the question is not whether the lost world existed, nor whether its survivors walked among early humans, nor whether their memory persists. The question is softer, subtler, more intimate. If humanity carries the fragments of their story, buried in myth, etched in stone, resonating through consciousness, then what is it we are meant to remember? And what would it mean if the story that began long before Earth's civilizations is still unfolding, quietly, in the background of our own becoming?